One of the most common customizations or configurations performed on every customer instance is the modification of the category and subcategory structure as defined by the customer themselves. We do provide in a baseline instance categories and subcategory values. However, these may need to be modified. You can simply modify them manually by choosing personalized choices. And by doing that, you have a way of adding additional categories. If you wanted to modify a subcategory, you'd want to choose the category that it's dependent on. Notice that these values actually do get modified based on the dependent values. If I wanted to add an additional subcategory for telephony, I would have to choose it first. Then I can right-click and choose Personalize Choices. You'll notice that I have the category telephony where I can add an additional entry here. This is all well and done if there are just a few modifications. However, if the customer provides you with hundreds of changes, it may be better to actually import that data via a spreadsheet. One option you have is if you have a spreadsheet that has category and subcategory defined. Basically, this would be the subcategory of connectivity. Site-specific would be another subcategory of connectivity. Then this becomes a dependency. Connectivity becomes the parent, so to speak, and multiple sites is dependent on that value. Where do we actually import into? So we right-click and choose on Show Choice List. You'll notice that the actual table that we're going into is choices. So this is a choices, and here are some of the values at the category level. Notice that we have an element that defines that it's a category type field. It defines the table. Also, we have a value that's stored in the database, and then a label which is displayed to the user. You can also set it to active or inactive depending whether it's available in the list or not. If I go back and do the same thing on subcategory, you will notice that I also have the same thing. However, a couple of things change. One thing is the element changes to subcategory. The incident is still the table. We still have a value and a label. And there is one other item that appears, and that's called dependent value. That's how when we choose Adobe, it's dependent on the top level category of desktop. And so if I were to choose desktop as my category, you'll notice that Adobe appears as one of the subcategories. So that's how that dependency is created. And you do have that option, obviously, if I wanted to right-click and just add a choice list from a manual method, you'll notice this already has selected category, the dependent value up top. If you want to import it, it's basically the same concept. What I've done is I've created some transform maps. One of them is for the category. And here we have the import set, that's the data loaded from the spreadsheet, mapped to the choices, syschoice table, which is the target table. And we have the category, which is pulled from the spreadsheet, mapped to the label field, and also category mapped to the value field. So those are, in essence, the category values here. These are all being mapped. And notice we also set a coalesce on that so that we don't end up with duplicate values. We also have a script because we have to map the appropriate element. You might recall that before the element was category or subcategory, depending on which element we're mapping into. So this is actually a top-level category. So we can just use a script called answer equals category, and it's going to map it to the target field of element on the syschoice table. We also have one more script, and this is for the name, because the syschoice table supports multiple tables. So we also have to define what table it's associated with on the syschoice list, and there we can define incident here. So those are a couple of the mappings you do have to do in order to bring in your categories successfully. Same thing for subcategories. If I look at the subcategories, it's basically the same thing. I'm still mapping to the syschoice table from my import set. I have my category, I have my subcategory value, which is being mapped to the label field. And I'm also having my subcategory value, which is being mapped to the value field. So this again is I'm taking this subcategory column now and mapping it into the value and the label field on the target syschoice table. Additionally, we have to define the dependent value. So this mapping is where I take the actual category value that's coming in and I map it to that dependent value field. So for each subcategory that's coming in, I want the dependent value to be its category that's next to it within that specific row. And that's where that dependency gets created. So this is an additional field mapping that has to be done for the subcategory. For the scripts, I do have to define that I'm mapping this into the table, and I'm going to define it here, incident, because I don't have the table name listed in this actual spreadsheet. I can just create a simple script where the answer that's going to be mapped to the table field is incident. And then we also have our element field, which has to be mapped as well. And instead of defining it as category now, this is going to be defined as subcategory to the element field. Once I have those in place, I pretty much have everything I need in order to run my transform. So the first thing you need to do is, just going to say, for some folks you might be completely new to ServiceNow, and so I wanted to show you how you load data. So that spreadsheet that I've just shown you here, if you wanted to load the spreadsheet into ServiceNow, you have to go to Load Data. And from there, I would just define my, my label. I'm just going to call it Category Import. And from here, I'm going to choose my file. In this case, I have my file, which I'm going to pull in. And then I'm going to click on Go. What this does is it actually creates an import set, which is basically a staging table where all those records are stored. And from here I can create a transform map. There's a UI action button that allows me to create a transform map. Now, I've already created these transform maps and shown you what they look like, but here's where you'd give it a name. This is the import set table, the staging table where all the data lives, and here's where you would choose your syschoice table as your target. Here's syschoice. Once you've defined that and you save the record, I'm just going to put in a name here. Once I've saved that, I've defined as well, I do have the ability to do auto mapping. Auto mapping is where I can map a field. So in this case, if I wanted to map category over to label and subcategory or category over to value, then that's how I can do an actual manual mapping. If I needed to create a script, such as I showed you, I'd have to do it from this window where I click on a new field mapping. From here I can click on new field map, and I have this use source script option. When I choose that, notice that the actual source field disappears because the source field no longer comes into play. I now have a way of writing in my particular answer. So in this case I would have something like category that would be mapped to my element field. And then I'd simply just save that. So that's basically the process that you would go through. Now when you've done all of your transforming or transform maps, you'd have to create one from your category. You want to do one for category, and you also want to do one for subcategory. So I'm going to go to the create incident, and I'm going to delete those items. I'm going to first of all delete my subcategories, which are all listed here. So now there's no subcategories after that's deleted. And then I'm going to delete the categories as well. So notice there's no subcategories. I'll delete my top level categories, which there's fewer of. And now we have nothing. I'm going to go to my transform maps, and I've already actually have the ability to run transform. So I've already created my transform maps. I have two valid ones. So I have one here for category and one for subcategory with the appropriate mapping. So I want to run category first, so it produces the values that, because my subcategory mapping has something with a dependent value. So the order here does make a difference. I would error out if I end up having subcategory first, because it's going to try to make the dependent value to something that doesn't exist. So you have to, the direction you map these is important. And I'm going to run my transform. After the transform completes, you'll notice that we receive a message of success. If I navigate back to the create new incident, I do have my options that have now been fed back in. For instance, if I choose hardware, I do have the 4 dependent values that are associated with hardware, which exactly match my 4 values that are associated in my spreadsheet. I hope this short recording was helpful to you, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Glenn Pinto.